Thrown out before winter, she built a cabin inside a giant barrel. Henning Dahl, who had buried his wife and infant daughter in the Great Gale of 1880, told her, "You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you." She had $9, 2 children, and needed shelter she could not build. On December 6, 1891, winds tore through the valley at 100 miles per hour. But 5 months earlier, Marta Lindqvist had never built anything more permanent than a chicken coop in her life. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday in late August, 1891. Marta read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. The Brennan Lumber Company required the premises vacated within 14 days. Her husband Gunnar had been dead for 6 weeks. The company owned the cabin. The company owed her nothing. She folded the paper carefully and set it on the table where her children sat eating their breakfast of cold oatmeal. Alma, 7 years old, watched her mother's face. Little Eric, 4, continued eating, unaware that the only home he remembered had just been taken from them. 14 days. Late August heat pressed against the cabin walls. By October, the rains would come. By December, the Pacific storms that swept through Sonoma County could drop temperatures into the 20s and bring winds that tore roofs from their rafters. Marta had $23. She had a dead husband's tools. She had 2 children who needed shelter before winter arrived. The Homestead Act allowed her to file a claim as a widow. 160 acres for $14 in filing fees. But filing a claim and surviving on it were different things entirely. The cheapest lumber for a proper cabin would cost $75. Hiring help to build it would cost another $50. The math was impossible before she even started. She walked to the window and looked out at the ridgeline where Gunnar had died, crushed beneath a 2,000-pound redwood when the choker cable snapped. The company paid for his burial. They did not pay his widow. Marta had $9 left after the filing fee. $9, 2 children, and winter 12 weeks away. On the 3rd day after the eviction notice, Marta walked the 4 miles to Brennan's general store to ask about available land. The store sat at a crossroads where 3 wagon tracks met, surrounded by the stumps of what had once been a redwood forest. Men loitered on the porch, waiting for lumber contracts or day labor. They watched her pass without speaking. Inside, Henning Dahl stood at the counter examining a hand axe. He was 63 years old, barrel-chested, with hands that looked like weathered oak roots. He had come to California in 1852, survived the floods of '62, the droughts of '64, and the Great Gale of 1880 that killed his wife and infant daughter when their cabin roof collapsed under the wind. He had rebuilt alone, buried his dead alone, and now ran 300 head of cattle on land. He had cleared himself. Everyone in the valley knew Henning Dahl. When he spoke about survival, people listened. Marta approached the counter, where the store clerk, a nervous young man named Jasper, spread a survey map across the worn wood. "There's unclaimed parcels along Dry Creek," Jasper said, pointing. "Good soil, water access." "What about structures?" Marta asked. "Anything with a cabin already standing?" Jasper shook his head. "Nothing habitable. The Kohler place burned last spring. The Swenson claim was abandoned." He hesitated. "There's the old Haas property. Winery went under when the phylloxera killed the vines. Buildings are still standing, but nobody wants it. The whole vineyard's dead. Ground's poisoned for grapes." "What buildings?" "Stone Winery, Copperidge Barn. They left everything when they walked away. Couldn't sell the equipment too far to haul without rail access." He glanced at Henning Dahl as if seeking permission to continue. "The wine tanks are still there, big ones, redwood." Henning Dahl set down the axe. His voice carried the weight of 4 decades in this valley. "You're Gunnar Lindqvist's widow." It was not a question. Marta nodded. How much money do you have? $9. Children? Two. Henning Dahl looked at her for a long moment. His eyes held no cruelty, only the flat assessment of someone who had watched too many people die from poor decisions. A woman alone cannot build a cabin before winter, he said. Not with $9, not with 90. You need walls, a roof, a chimney. You need seasoned timber that won't warp and split when the rains come. You need foundation stones or your floor will flood. The labor alone, he shook his head. You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you. The words landed like hammer blows. Marta felt her throat tighten. I have to try, she said. Trying is how people die out here. Henning Dahl picked up the axe again, testing its edge with his thumb. The valley is full of graves of people who tried. He paid for his purchase and walked out. The bell above the door chimed once, then fell silent. Jasper cleared his throat. The Haas property is 4 miles east. I can show you on the map. Marta looked at the map. 4 miles from town. No neighbors within sight. A dead vineyard. An empty winery. And equipment nobody wanted. She had $9 and 12 weeks. The Haas property sat at the end of a wagon track that had nearly vanished under 3 years of grass and blackberry brambles. Marta walked it the following morning, leaving the children with a neighbor who charged her 50 cents for the day. 50 cents she could not spare. The stone winery building was intact but roofless. Wooden beams had collapsed inward, leaving a skeleton of walls around an open pit where wine had once fermented in the California sun. Mold blackened the stones. The smell of rotting wood hung in the still air. The cooperage barn was worse. Half the structure had fallen completely, planks scattered across the ground like broken bones. The remaining half leaned at an angle that suggested the next strong wind would finish what neglect had started. But inside the barn, still standing in rows like monuments to a dead industry, stood the wine vats. Marta stopped. She counted 7 of them. The smallest was perhaps 8 feet in diameter. The largest was enormous. 14 feet tall and 12 feet across, bound by iron hoops as thick as her wrist, built from redwood staves nearly 3 inches thick. The morning light filtered through gaps in the barn roof and fell across its curved surface like light through a cathedral window. She approached it slowly. The wood was dark with age and wine stain, but when she pressed her palm against it, she felt solidity. No give, no rot. The staves fit together so tightly that she could barely see the seams where they joined. She walked around the vat's circumference, 37 feet. She had paced it 3 times to be sure. 37 feet of enclosed space, protected by walls nearly 3 inches thick. Walls built to hold 12,000 gallons of liquid under pressure. Walls that had stood empty for 3 years without warping, without splitting, without failing. An idea formed in her mind, an idea so strange that she dismissed it immediately. Then she walked around the vat again, and the idea returned, and this time she did not dismiss it. A proper cabin for 2 rooms would need walls 16 feet long and 14 feet wide. Floor to ceiling, 8 feet. That was over 300 square feet of living space, the minimum anyone considered acceptable. This vat, laid on its side, would give her an enclosed cylinder 12 feet in diameter and 14 feet long. The interior floor space would be smaller than a proper cabin, perhaps 80 square feet of flat surface, if she built a floor at the widest point. But the walls would be impenetrable. The curved ceiling would shed rain like a river stone. And the whole structure already existed. She would not need to build it. She would only need to move it, secure it, and make it habitable. $9 could not buy lumber for walls, but $9 could buy hinges for a door. Marta stood in the ruins of the cooperage barn, looking at a wine vat that weighed several tons, and she began to calculate. The problem was weight. A redwood vat of this size, even empty, weighed close to 3,000 pounds. The iron hoops alone weighed several hundred. Moving it would require equipment she did not own, animals she could not afford, and help that no one would offer a widow with $9 and a plan that sounded like madness. But the vat did not need to travel far. It only needed to move from inside the collapsing barn to solid ground outside, perhaps 60 feet, and it did not need to be lifted. It was round. It could roll. She returned to the Haas property the next morning with rope, with gunner's pry bar, and with her children. Alma was old enough to fetch water and hand tools. Eric was old enough to stay out of the way when told. They would help because there was no one else. The first task was clearing a path from the barn to the slight rise where she planned to secure the vat. She worked with a hand axe and a brush hook, cutting blackberry canes until her arms burned and her palms blistered through her gloves. By noon, she had cleared 20 feet. 40 remained. Alma brought her water from the creek. The girl's face was solemn, watching her mother hack at brambles with a ferocity that frightened her. "Mama," she said, "what are we doing?" Marta stopped. Sweat ran down her forehead and stung her eyes. Her shoulders ached with a deep, grinding pain that she knew would be worse tomorrow. "We're building a house," she said. "In the barrel?" "In the vat, yes." Alma considered this. "It doesn't look like a house." "It will." The girl nodded slowly, the way children do when they trust their parents beyond the limits of understanding. She handed her mother the water jar and went back to minding her brother without asking any more questions. By the end of the first week, Marta had cleared the path, removed the rotted planking from around the vat's base, and dug channels to guide it when it began to roll. She had also attracted attention. Agnes Olmsted appeared on the 7th day. She was 41 years old, a widow herself, with a small farm 3 miles south that she ran with the help of her teenage son. She was practical, unsentimental, and utterly certain that Marta had lost her mind. "I heard you were digging over here," Agnes said, standing at the edge of the cleared path with her arms crossed. "Came to see for myself." Marta straightened up from the channel she was cutting. Her back screamed. Her hands had blistered, healed, and blistered again. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, and the hollows beneath her cheekbones had deepened into shadows. "I'm preparing the ground," Marta said. "For what?" Marta pointed at the vat. Agnes stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Marta, then back at the vat, then at the 2 children playing near the creek. When she spoke, her voice was flat with disbelief. "You mean to live in that?" "I do." "It's a wine barrel." "It's a structure. 3-inch walls, iron reinforcement, 12 feet wide and 14 feet long, more solid than half the cabins in this valley." Agnes walked closer to the vat, examining it the way she might examine a horse someone was trying to sell her at an impossible price. She rapped her knuckles against the wood. She studied the iron hoops. She peered inside through the bung hole at the top. "How do you plan to move it?" she asked. "Roll it." "By yourself?" "I've built channels, inclined plane. The ground slopes toward the rise where I'll set it." "And then?" "Cut a door in one end, build a floor inside, install a small stove for heat, seal the seams against weather." Agnes turned to face her. "You're describing a home made from a barrel. People don't live in barrels, Marta. You know this. The whole valley will think you've gone simple from grief. The whole valley can think what they like. And when the winter storms come, when the winds blow 60 miles an hour and the rain falls sideways for 3 days straight, that thing will roll, it will blow, it will hold." Marta heard her own voice, hard and certain. "It's built to withstand 12,000 gallons of liquid pressing outward against those walls, thousands of pounds of pressure. A storm is nothing compared to that." Agnes was silent for a long moment. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed against a dead tree. You have children, she said finally. This isn't just about you. I know. If you're wrong, I know. Agnes looked at the vat one more time. She shook her head slowly, a gesture that might have been pity or might have been something closer to respect. I think you're making a mistake, she said, but I've been wrong before. She turned and walked back toward the road without saying goodbye. Marta watched her go, then picked up her shovel and returned to work. The sun was still high. She had hours of daylight left, and winter was now only 11 weeks away. The following day, Marta began the process of tipping the vat. The Cooperage barn's roof had rotted away above it, leaving the massive cylinder exposed to open sky. Birds had nested in its interior. Leaves and debris had accumulated over 3 years of abandonment, but the structure itself was sound. She had spent 2 nights planning the mechanics. The vat currently stood upright on its bottom head, the flat circular end. To roll it, she needed to tip it onto its side. This meant overcoming 3,000 pounds of vertical mass with nothing but rope, leverage, and the inclined channels she had dug. The answer was controlled failure. She dug a shallow trench along one edge of the vat's base. She positioned her longest rope around the vat at its midpoint, running the rope through a crude pulley she had rigged from a barn beam and gunner's block and tackle. She stacked scrap lumber from the collapsed barn to create a landing surface that would catch the vat as it fell. Then she began to dig deeper on the tipping side. The physics were simple. Remove enough support from one edge and the vat would begin to lean. Once it passed the tipping point, gravity would do the rest. The rope would control the speed of the fall. The landing surface would prevent damage. That was the theory. The practice terrified her. On the morning she was ready to attempt the tip, she sent the children to Agnes Olmsted's farm. She paid Agnes with 2 of her remaining $9, money she desperately needed but could not risk her children to save. If the vat fell wrong, if the rope snapped, if the physics she had calculated in her head turned out to be fantasy, she would die alone. Her children would not watch. She dug the final shovelful of dirt from the tipping edge at 10 minutes past 8 in the morning. For a long moment, nothing happened. The vat stood as it had stood for 3 years, silent and immovable. Then it groaned. The sound was unlike anything she had heard, a deep, wooden complaint that resonated through the ground beneath her feet. The vat shifted. One iron hoop scraped against stone with a shriek that sent birds exploding from the surrounding trees. Marta seized the rope and braced herself. The vat tipped. Slowly at first, then faster. The massive cylinder leaned toward her like a falling tree. The rope burned through her gloves. She pulled, trying to control the descent, feeling the full weight of 3,000 pounds translated through hemp and into her shoulders. Her boots slid in the dirt. Her arms screamed. The vat hit the landing surface with a sound like thunder. Dust billowed. Debris flew. Marta was yanked forward and fell to her knees, losing her grip on the rope as the vat completed its rotation and settled onto its side with a final shuddering boom. She stayed on her knees for several minutes, breathing hard, her heart pounding against her ribs. Dust settled around her like snow. When she finally looked up, the vat lay on its side exactly where she had planned. The landing surface had absorbed the impact. The iron hoops were intact. The staves had not cracked or separated. It had worked. She stood up slowly, testing her shoulders and back for damage. Everything hurt, but nothing was broken. She walked around the vat, examining every inch of its surface. The wood was scuffed where it had struck the ground. One of the iron hoops had dented slightly, but the structure was sound. Marta pressed her palm against the curved wall just as she had done 2 weeks earlier. The wood was warm from the morning sun, solid, unmoving. For the first time since the eviction notice, she allowed herself to feel something like hope. Rolling the vat from the barn to the rise took 4 days. The channels Marta had dug formed a shallow track, just deep enough to guide the vat's path and prevent it from veering off course. She worked with rope and pry bar, advancing the cylinder inches at a time. Push from one side until the vat rotated slightly. Wedge the pry bar underneath to prevent it from rolling back. Move to the other side and repeat. 1,200 pounds of pressure distributed across each movement. Her arms developed a shaking tremor that would not stop. Her back locked up each morning, requiring 10 minutes of agonized stretching before she could stand upright. She ate when she remembered, slept when her body refused to continue, and rose before dawn each day to begin again. The children returned from Agnes's farm on the second day of rolling. They were too young to help with the heavy work, but Alma took over all cooking and water carrying while Marta focused entirely on the vat. The girl made oatmeal in the morning, bread and cheese at midday, and beans at night. She fed her brother. She kept the fire going. She did not complain. On the evening of the 4th day, the vat reached the rise. The spot Marta had chosen sat on a slight elevation that would allow water to drain away from the structure's base. She had already laid foundation logs, salvaged beams from the collapsed barn, to create a stable cradle that would prevent the vat from rolling. With the last of her strength, she levered the vat into position and wedged it in place with stones and dirt. Then she sat down in the grass and wept. She wept from exhaustion and from pain and from a fear she had not allowed herself to feel during the 2 weeks of brutal labor. She wept for Gunnar, who should have been beside her. She wept for her children, who deserved better than a mother who planned to house them in a wine barrel. She wept until she had nothing left, and then she wiped her face with her sleeve and stood up. $7 remained, 10 weeks until winter. The vat still needed a door, a floor, a stovepipe, and weatherproofing. The work was only beginning. Cyrus Whitfield arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after the vat reached its foundation. He rode a bay gelding worth more than everything Marta owned combined, and he wore a suit that had no place on a country road in Sonoma County. His hair was oiled, his mustache was waxed. His eyes, beneath a broad-brimmed hat, held the flat patience of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was a land agent for the Pacific Development Company. His job was acquiring properties by purchase when possible, by pressure when necessary, by patience when neither worked. The Haas property, abandoned and unclaimed for 3 years, had been on his list for months. He had planned to file his own claim once the abandonment period expired. Then a widow had filed first. Marta was cutting the door opening when he rode up. She had marked an oval on the flat end of the vat, 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide at the center, large enough to pass through without stooping, and she was using Gunnar's crosscut saw to make the cut. The work was slow. Redwood was soft compared to oak, but 3 inches of any wood took time. Whitfield dismounted and watched her work for several minutes before speaking. "Mrs. Lindqvist." Marta did not look up. "Mr. Whitfield, I see you're making improvements." "I am?" "To a wine vat." She paused her sawing and straightened up, pressing one hand against the small of her back. She was filthy with sawdust and sweat. Her dress had torn at the shoulder. Her hair had escaped its braid and hung in strings around her face. "To my home," she said. Whitfield smiled. The expression did not reach his eyes. "Mrs. Lindqvist, let me be direct. The Pacific Development Company has an interest in this property. We would be willing to purchase your claim for—" He paused, as if calculating. $25, cash, today. "The property is not for sale." "You haven't even heard my terms." "I heard the number. $25 for 160 acres. 160 acres of vineyard land with water access and a stone building. You're insulting me. Whitfield's smile flickered but did not disappear. The vineyard is dead. The stone building is roofless. The only structure on the property is a barrel you appear to be living in with your children. $25 is generous. No. 30. No. The smile was gone now. Whitfield took a step closer, close enough that Marta could smell the pomade in his hair. Mrs. Lindquist, you cannot prove up this claim. The Homestead Act requires 5 years of continuous habitation and demonstrated improvements. You have no money, no materials, and no help. By spring, you'll be begging the county for relief. By next summer, you'll have abandoned this property, and I'll file a claim on the improvement. Marta met his eyes. She did not step back. Then you can wait until next summer, she said, or you can ride out of here now and stop wasting both our time. Whitfield held her gaze for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, contemptuous sound. You're going to put those children in a barrel for the winter, he said. When the storms come, and they will come, and that thing rolls down the hill with your children inside it, you remember I offered you a way out. He mounted his horse without waiting for a response. Marta watched him ride back down the wagon track until he disappeared around the bend. Then she picked up her saw and returned to cutting the door. Her hands were shaking, whether from exhaustion or anger she could not tell. The door took 5 days to complete. Cutting the oval was only the beginning. Marta had to salvage hinges from the collapsed barn, fashion a frame from scrap lumber, and build the door itself from planks she pulled from what remained of the cooperage building. The result was crude but functional, a thick slab of redwood that swung inward on iron hinges and could be barred from inside with a heavy beam. The floor took another week. She built a platform at the vat's widest point, creating a flat surface roughly 8 feet long and 10 feet wide. The curved walls rose around this floor like the inside of a ship's hull, but the space was larger than she had calculated, large enough for 2 straw mattresses, a small table, and the cast iron stove she bought in town for $4.50. The stove was the largest expense, but it was not negotiable. A winter without heat was a death sentence. The stove was small, designed for a prospector's tent, but it would burn wood efficiently and vent through a pipe she ran through a hole cut in the vat's upper curve. By the time she finished, she had $2.37 remaining, 8 weeks until the first winter storms. The structure was weather-tight. She had sealed the seams between staves with pitch salvaged from the winery, and the cooperage construction was so precise that rain beaded on the surface and ran off like water from a duck's back. The 3-inch walls provided insulation that made the interior noticeably warmer than the outside air, even before she lit the stove. The curved ceiling meant the space felt smaller than its measurements suggested, but it also meant every inch was usable, no wasted corner space, no awkward angles. It was not a cabin. It was not even close to what anyone would call a proper home, but it was shelter. And it was hers. The first test came in late October. A Pacific storm swept down from the north, bringing 2 days of rain and winds that howled through the valley at 40 miles per hour. Marta lay awake through the first night, listening to the wind scream past the curved walls of the vat, waiting for the structure to move, to roll, to fail. It did not move. The rain hammered against the redwood staves and ran off in sheets. The wind found no flat surface to push against. It flowed around the cylinder the way water flows around a river stone, pressing inward without finding purchase. Inside, the air was still. The stove glowed red. The children slept. By morning, the storm had passed. Marta stepped outside to find branches scattered across the property, the wagon track flooded, and half the shingles torn from what remained of the cooperage barn roof. But the vat was exactly where she had left it, unmoved, unharmed. Agnes Olmsted arrived that afternoon. She walked around the vat twice without speaking. Then she looked at Marta. 40-mile-an-hour winds, she said. The Anderson barn lost its roof. The Petersons' chicken coop is in the creek. I heard. This thing didn't budge. No. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. I thought you were crazy, she said finally. I still think you might be crazy. But that, she pointed at the vat. That held. Marta nodded. It held. The winter storms are worse. I know. 60, 70 miles an hour. The 1880 storm hit 100. My husband's cousin died in that one. Roof collapsed on his family while they slept. Marta looked at the vat, at the curved walls that had turned aside 40-mile-an-hour wind without a tremor. She thought about the physics that had made it possible. 12,000 gallons of liquid pressing outward, thousands of pounds of force contained by those staves and hoops. A storm was pressure from the outside, but the vat had been built to withstand pressure in every direction. This will hold, she said. Agnes studied her face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy something. I have extra flour, Agnes said. More than I need before spring. I'll sell you 10 pounds at cost, 35 cents. It was charity disguised as commerce. Both women knew it. Marta's pride flared, but she crushed it down. Thank you, she said. I'll take it. Agnes nodded once, then turned and walked back toward her farm. Marta watched her go, then returned to her work. There was chinking to check, firewood to split, and a second stovepipe joint to seal before the next storm came. The first test had been 40 miles per hour. The second test would be stronger, and somewhere out on the Pacific, gathering force over thousands of miles of open water, the worst storm in a decade was building toward the California coast. Chunk 2 continues. November brought cold that settled into the valley like a weight. Morning frost silvered the grass. The creek ran slower, thickened by temperatures that hovered just above freezing. Marta split firewood until her arms ached, stacking it against the vat's curved exterior where the overhang of the upper curve would keep it dry. Inside, the space had transformed. The children's mattresses lay against the curved wall, separated by a curtain Marta had sewn from flour sacks. The small table held their few dishes and the oil lamp that provided light after dark. The cast-iron stove crouched in the center of the floor, its pipe rising through the hole she had cut and sealed with pitch and scrap metal. When the fire burned, the interior temperature climbed to 60 degrees, then 65, then 70. Warmth that radiated from the iron and was held by 3 inches of redwood on every side. The vat's insulating properties exceeded her calculations. Heat that would have escaped through the cracks of a conventional cabin stayed trapped within the sealed cooperage. The curved ceiling, instead of wasting space, created a pocket of warm air above their heads that acted like a second layer of protection. On mornings when the outside temperature dropped to 28 degrees, the interior never fell below 45, even when the stove had burned down to embers overnight. Marta kept a thermometer hanging from a nail near the door, a small extravagance she had purchased for 15 cents at Brennan's store. She recorded the temperatures each morning in a notebook. Outside, inside, difference. The numbers told a story that even skeptics would have to acknowledge. A 20-degree difference, sometimes 25. The walls were working exactly as she had calculated. She also recorded wind speeds, estimating them by watching the trees. Calm, light breeze, moderate wind that bent the smaller branches, strong wind that moved the larger limbs. On November 12th, a gust tore a dead branch from an oak near the creek, and she marked it, strong wind, structure stable, No movement detected. The vat had not shifted a single inch since she had wedged it into its foundation. Agnes Olmsted visited once a week, bringing small gifts disguised as trades: eggs for mending, butter for help with her accounts. Each visit, she examined the vat with the same mixture of skepticism and reluctant admiration. She had stopped calling it a barrel. Now she called it your place, or sometimes that thing. But the contempt had faded from her voice. Still standing, she said in mid-November, running her hand along the iron hoop nearest the door. Still standing. Henning Dahl came by my farm yesterday, asked about you. Marta paused in her work. She had been patching a hole in Eric's trousers. What did he want? Wanted to know if you were still here, if you'd given up yet. Agnes shrugged. I told him you weren't going anywhere. What did he say? Nothing, just nodded and rode off. Agnes looked at the vat again. He's been watching the sky, says the barometer's been falling for a week, says it feels like 80 all over again. Marta had heard the same from others. Old-timers who remembered the great gale of 1880 spoke in low voices about the signs, the strange stillness in the mornings, the animals acting nervous, the ache in joints that had healed wrong decades ago. Horses refused to settle. Dogs whined at nothing. The air itself felt heavy, pressed down by something building far out over the Pacific. A storm was coming. Everyone could feel it. The vat held in October, Marta said, keeping her voice steady. 40-mile winds. It will hold again. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable. The 80 storm wasn't 40 miles an hour, Marta. It was 100, maybe more. Henning lost his wife and baby girl that night. The roof came down on them while they slept. I know. Do you? Do you really understand what a 100-mile wind does to a structure? Marta set down the trousers and met Agnes's eyes. I understand that this vat was built to hold 12,000 gallons of liquid, 12,000 gallons pressing outward against every inch of these walls. That's thousands of pounds of pressure, Agnes. Constant, relentless pressure. A storm pushes from the outside. This vat was designed to resist pressure from the inside. The physics don't change just because the direction does. Agnes was silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly. I hope you're right, she said. God help you if you're wrong. She left without saying goodbye. Marta watched her walk down the wagon track, her figure growing smaller until she disappeared around the bend. Then she picked up Eric's trousers and resumed her mending. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. The first snow fell on December 3rd. Light flurries that melted as they touched the ground, dusting the valley in white that vanished by noon. But the message was clear. Winter had arrived in earnest. Eric developed a cough that same day. At first, Marta thought little of it. Children caught colds, especially when the seasons changed. She brewed tea with honey from Agnes's hives, kept him close to the stove, wrapped him in the warmest blanket she owned, and watched. By December 4th, the cough had developed a rhythm, 3 sharp barks followed by a wet, rattling gasp. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing. His skin felt warm to the touch, warmer than the stove-heated air around him. By December 5th, the warmth had become heat. His forehead burned with fever. His cheeks flushed red, then pale, then red again. He refused food, turning his face away from the spoon, crying weakly when she tried to coax him to eat. His cough had deepened into something that seemed to come from the bottom of his lungs, each spasm shaking his small body like a rag doll. Marta knew what it might be. She had seen pneumonia before, had watched it kill a neighbor's child in Minnesota before she and Gunnar had come west. The progression was unmistakable: fever, cough, labored breathing. Then, if the body could not fight off the infection, a gradual drowning as the lungs filled with fluid. The nearest doctor was in Healdsburg, 12 miles away over roads that the November rains had already turned treacherous. She had no horse, no wagon, and $1.87 to her name. Even if she could reach the doctor, she could not afford his fee. Even if she could afford his fee, she could not leave Alma alone for the full day the journey would require. She sat beside her son's mattress through the night of December 5th, listening to his labored breathing and watching the shadows thrown by the stove's glow across the curved ceiling. The redwood walls surrounded her like the ribs of some great beast. Outside, she could hear the wind beginning to rise. Not the howling gale that the old-timers feared, but a steady pressure that moaned through the trees and pressed against the vat's curved surface. Alma slept fitfully on the other side of the flour sack curtain. She was 7 years old, too young to lose her brother, too old not to understand what was happening. She had asked, before falling asleep, if Eric was going to die. Marta had not answered. She had not known what to say. By morning, Eric's fever had climbed higher still. His lips were dry and cracked despite the water she had dripped between them through the night. His eyes, when he opened them, held a glassy distance that terrified her, as if he were looking at something far away, something only the very sick could see. She could not carry him 12 miles to Healdsburg. She could not leave Alma alone. She could not afford a doctor even if she could reach one. She could not do nothing. Agnes arrived at noon, earlier than her usual weekly visit. She took one look at Eric, at the fever-bright eyes, the labored breathing, the small body that seemed to have shrunk overnight, and made a decision without being asked. "I'll ride for the doctor," she said, already pulling on her coat. "My son can manage the farm for a day. You stay here. Keep him warm. Keep him drinking. Don't let the fever climb any higher than it already has." "Agnes, I can't pay." "I'm not asking you to pay." Agnes's voice was sharp, cutting off the protest before it could fully form. "I'm asking you to keep that child alive until I get back. Dr. Reeves owes me a favor from when I sat with his wife during her last illness. He'll come. You just make sure there's someone for him to treat when he arrives." She was gone before Marta could argue further. The sound of hoofbeats faded down the wagon track, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Then there was only the wind, rising, and her son's rattling breath, and the creak of the vat's iron hoops as the temperature continued to drop. The storm announced itself at 4 in the afternoon on December 6, 1891. Marta was boiling water for tea, her third pot of the day, trying to get fluids into Eric's fever-racked body, when the light changed. One moment the afternoon sun filtered weakly through the clouds, casting pale shadows through the open door. The next, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and green and yellow swirling together, colors that did not belong in the same sky, colors that meant violence was coming. She had just enough time to close the door. The wind hit 30 seconds later. It did not build gradually, the way normal storms approached. It arrived like a physical blow, slamming against the vat with a force that made the entire structure shudder on its foundation. The impact knocked Marta sideways. She grabbed the table to steady herself. The oil lamp toppled from its hook and shattered on the floor, sending burning oil across the planks. Marta stamped out the flames with her boots, her heart pounding. In the sudden darkness, the only light now coming from the stove's glow through its iron grate, she heard Alma scream. "Stay down!" Marta shouted over the wind's roar. "Stay on the floor! Don't move!" She crawled across the floor to where Eric lay, wrapping her body around his small form as the wind rose to a howl that drowned out every other sound. The stove pipe rattled in its housing. the metal joints grinding against each other with a shriek that set her teeth on edge. The door, her crude, heavy door, strained against its bar, the planks flexing inward with each gust as if something massive were trying to force its way inside. Something struck the exterior of the vat with a crack like a gunshot. A branch, she thought, or perhaps a piece of debris from one of the ruined buildings. She flinched, waiting for the walls to splinter, waiting for the wind to find a weakness and tear them apart. The walls did not splinter. The wind screamed around the curved surface, finding no flat edge to grip, no corner to catch, no purchase for the fury it carried. The vat trembled, but did not move. The foundation logs, wedged into the earth and weighted with stones, held fast. The iron hoops creaked and groaned, the metal contracting in the cold. But they did not give. Marta lit a candle with shaking hands, sheltering the flame with her body until it caught. In its weak, flickering light, she could see Alma pressed against the curved wall near the door, her face white as chalk, her eyes wide with terror. Eric lay on his mattress, too sick to understand what was happening, his breath coming in short, wet gasps that were barely audible beneath the storm's roar. "It's holding," Marta said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, too calm, too steady, as if someone else were speaking through her mouth. "The walls are holding. We're safe in here." Alma stared at her. Tears streaked her cheeks. "Mama, what's happening?" "A storm. A bad one." Marta moved to her daughter and pulled her close, feeling the girl's trembling body against her own. "But we're inside, and the walls are strong, and we're going to be fine. I promise you. We're going to be fine." She did not know if she believed it, but she said it, and she kept saying it as the wind rose higher and the night descended, and the worst storm to hit Sonoma County in 11 years tried to tear her home apart. The storm raged through the night. Marta lost track of time. Hours blurred together into an endless present tense of darkness and noise and fear. There was only the howling wind, the periodic crashes as trees fell somewhere in the valley, the rattle of the stovepipe, the creak of the iron hoops, and the endless task of keeping her children alive through whatever was happening outside. She fed the stove until her wood supply ran low. Then she fed it sparingly, adding one piece at a time, rationing heat against the unknown hours ahead. The temperature inside the vat dropped. She could feel it on her skin, could see her breath fogging in the candlelight, but it did not drop as far as it should have. The 3-inch walls held the warmth, even as the wind screamed to steal it away. She dripped water into Eric's mouth when he would take it. She held Alma when the girl sobbed. She sang songs when the sobbing stopped. Old songs from her childhood in Sweden, songs her mother had sung to her, songs she had almost forgotten until they came back to her now, in the darkness, with the world trying to end outside. Sometime after midnight, she guessed by the depth of the darkness, by the ache in her back from hours of sitting upright, the wind reached a pitch that seemed impossible, a sound beyond sound, a pressure that made her ears ache and her chest tighten. The vat groaned. The door flexed inward against its bar, the gap at the edges widening until she could see the blackness of the storm through the cracks. She pressed herself against the curved wall and felt the wood vibrating under her palms like a living thing. The whole structure was resonating with the force being applied to it, every stave and hoop working together to distribute the pressure, to hold against what should have been overwhelming force. 100 miles per hour. That was the estimate she would hear later from men who had instruments to measure such things. 100 miles per hour sustained, with gusts that exceeded 120. The highest wind speed ever recorded in the valley. The kind of wind that had killed Henning Dahl's wife and infant daughter 11 years earlier, collapsing their cabin roof while they slept. The vat held. The physics that had built it, the physics of containing 12,000 gallons under pressure, meant that external force distributed across the curved surface rather than concentrating at weak points. A flat wall would have caught the wind like a sail, the pressure mounting until something gave. A curved wall let the wind flow around it, the same way a river flows around a boulder. The force was still there, but it had nowhere to focus, nowhere to punch through. The iron hoops, engineered to prevent the staves from separating under internal stress, performed the same function against external compression. They held the cylinder together, maintaining its shape, preventing any single stave from being driven inward or outward by the storm's fury. The weight of the structure, 3,000 pounds of redwood and iron, anchored it against the foundation logs like a ship moored in harbor. The wind could push, but it could not lift. It could not tip what it could not get beneath. Around them, the valley was being destroyed. Marta heard the cooperage barn go at some point past 1 in the morning, a grinding crash that cut through even the wind's roar, the sound of lumber shattering and timbers falling. The barn had been leaning for months. The storm finished what neglect had started. She heard other sounds, too. Distant crashes that might have been other structures failing, the crack of trees snapping somewhere on the ridge, a sound like thunder that was not thunder. She learned later it was the Peterson barn's roof being torn off and thrown a quarter-mile into a field. Later she would learn the full scope of the damage. 7 barns destroyed within 5 miles of the Haas property. 2 cabins collapsed with families inside, the Morrisons and the Hendricks, both rescued from the wreckage by neighbors who braved the storm to dig them out. 1 death. Old Silas Morrow, who had refused to leave his cabin despite his daughter's pleading, and was crushed when the ridgepole snapped and brought the roof down on his bed. Livestock scattered across 3 counties, some never recovered. The railroad tracks blocked by fallen redwoods for a week. The wagon road to Hillsburg, impassable for 3 days. But Marta knew none of this during the night. She knew only the vat, the darkness, the wind, and her children. She knew the sound of Eric's breathing, which she monitored constantly, listening for any change that might signal the fever was winning. She knew the weight of Alma against her side, the girl's fingers clutching her dress, the small body that trembled with every crash and groan. At 3 in the morning, Eric's fever broke. She felt it happen, the moment when the burning heat under her palm gave way to something cooler, something closer to normal. His breathing eased. The wet rattle faded. His body relaxed against the mattress, the tension draining from muscles that had been clenched against pain and fever for 2 days. He opened his eyes. They were clear, present, seeing her. "Mama?" he said, his voice small but steady. "I'm thirsty." Marta wept for the 2nd time since coming to the Haas property. This time, she wept with relief so profound it felt like its own kind of collapse. The tears came without warning, without control, streaming down her face as she fumbled for the water jar, as she lifted her son's head and helped him drink, as the storm continued to rage outside walls that had held and would keep holding. She gave him water. She checked his forehead again and again, convinced the fever would return, convinced this was a false hope that the night would snatch away. It did not return. The crisis had passed, both crises, the sickness and the storm, breaking at almost the same moment, as if God had decided that she had been tested enough. By dawn, the wind had fallen to 40 miles per hour. By noon, it was merely blustery, strong enough to bend the smaller trees, but nothing like the monster that had howled through the darkness. Marta unbarred the door and stepped outside for the first time in 20 hours. The world had changed. Trees lay everywhere, their roots torn from the earth, their trunks snapped like kindling. The cooperage barn was a scattered ruin, Planks and beams spread across 100-foot radius as if a giant hand had swept them aside. The path she had cleared for the vat was buried under debris, branches, leaves, pieces of someone else's fence that had blown in from God knew where. The creek ran brown with mud and churned with branches. Its banks overflowed, the water spreading across the low ground in a temporary lake. Smoke rose from somewhere to the south, someone's home, burning in the aftermath, perhaps from an overturned stove or a fallen lamp. Smoke rose from the north, too, though that might have been a chimney. It was hard to tell. But the vat stood exactly where she had placed it 5 months earlier. The curved walls showed scratches where debris had struck them, long gouges in the redwood that would need to be sealed before the next rain. One of the iron hoops had a new dent where something heavy had struck it. The door frame had warped slightly from the pressure, and she would need to plane it before it would close properly again. But the structure was intact. The walls had held. Her children were alive inside. Marta sat down on the foundation log and watched the clouds break apart above the valley. The sun came through in patches, illuminating the destruction in stark, golden light. She could see 3 fallen trees from where she sat. She could see the remains of the cooperage barn. She could see the wagon track washed out and impassable. And she could see, coming up that wagon track, 2 figures on horseback picking their way through the debris. Agnes Olmsted had found the doctor, and they had ridden through the aftermath of the storm to reach her. Dr. Samuel Reeves was 53 years old, trained in Philadelphia, and had practiced medicine in Sonoma County for 18 years. He had treated every illness the frontier could produce. He had set bones, amputated limbs, delivered babies in conditions that would have horrified his professors. He had pronounced death over more children than he cared to count. He arrived at the Haas property at 2 p.m. on December 7th, exhausted from a ride that had required detours around washed-out roads, fallen trees, and debris fields that stretched for hundreds of yards. Agnes had briefed him on the situation during the journey. The widow, the sick child, the unconventional shelter she had built from a wine vat. He had assumed Agnes was exaggerating, the way people often did when describing something unusual. He was not prepared for what he found. The child was recovering. Dr. Reeves examined Eric thoroughly, listening to his lungs, checking his temperature, palpating his lymph nodes, watching the rhythm of his breathing. The fever had broken naturally, as fevers sometimes did when the body's defenses finally overwhelmed the infection. The lungs were clearing. Rest, warmth, and fluids would complete the healing. There was nothing for him to do but confirm what the mother already knew. Her son would live. But the structure stopped him cold. He stood outside the vat for several minutes, not speaking, his medical bag hanging forgotten from his hand. He walked around it slowly, examining the walls, the hoops, the foundation logs, the door that Marta had cut and hung herself. He pressed his palm against the wood. He rapped his knuckles against it, listening to the sound. He peered inside at the living space she had created. The mattresses, the stove, the table, the curtain dividing the children's sleeping areas. "You rode out the storm in this," he said finally. It was not a question. "Yes." 100 miles winds. The worst storm since 80. "Yes." And this structure did not move. It moved slightly during the worst gusts, a vibration, but it did not shift from its foundation. It did not roll. It did not collapse. Dr. Reeves was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amazement. "Mrs. Lindqvist, I have treated 3 families today whose cabins collapsed. The Peterson children have broken bones, the boy's arm, the girl's collarbone. Mrs. Anderson is being treated for exposure after spending the night in a creek bed with her infant because their cabin lost its roof, and they had no choice but to flee. Silas Morrow is dead, God rest him." He shook his head slowly. and you were warm. Your children were safe. Your sick child's fever broke in a wine vat. It's not a barrel, Marta said automatically. It's a vat, built to withstand pressure. The principle is, I don't need the physics lesson, Mrs. Lindqvist. But his tone was kind, not dismissive. I can see the results well enough. He refused payment for the visit. He said he had done nothing to earn it. The child was already recovering, and he had administered no treatment. But before he left, he asked detailed questions about the structure, the thickness of the walls, the diameter of the hoops, the method she had used to seal the seams, the way she had anchored it to the foundation, the size of the interior, the placement of the stove, the path of the chimney pipe. He wrote everything in a small notebook he carried in his vest pocket, his handwriting cramped and precise. There are families who will need to rebuild, he said. Families who lost everything last night. They should know about this. I'll tell anyone who wants to listen. I believe you will. He mounted his horse and looked down at her. Mrs. Lindqvist, I have lived in this valley for nearly 20 years. I have seen every kind of shelter fail in every kind of weather. I have never, not once, seen anything like what you've built here. He tipped his hat and rode away, following Agnes back toward the main road. Marta watched them until they disappeared around the bend, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the wind that still gusted through the wreckage of the valley. Henning Dahl arrived 3 days later. Marta saw him coming up what remained of the wagon track, walking because his horse had thrown a shoe somewhere on the debris-covered road, and he had been unwilling to wait for the farrier. He was carrying something under one arm, wrapped in burlap cloth. He stopped at the edge of the cleared area and looked at the vat for a long time without speaking. His weathered face was unreadable, but his eyes moved slowly over every detail, the scratches on the walls, the dented hoop, the warped door frame, the foundation that had not shifted. Mrs. Lindqvist, he said finally. Mr. Dahl. He continued looking at the vat. I told you that you would freeze. I told you those children would freeze with you. Marta said nothing. She waited. I have been building cabins in this valley for 40 years, Henning Dahl said. I have buried people who died in structures I helped build. My wife, my daughter. His voice caught slightly on the last word, the only crack in his granite composure. I thought I knew what would stand and what would fall. He fell silent again. The wind gusted through the trees, carrying the smell of smoke from somewhere far away. I was wrong, he said. He unwrapped the burlap bundle. Inside was a cured ham, perhaps 10 pounds, dark and fragrant with smoke and salt, enough meat to last her family for weeks. This is not charity, he said. This is acknowledgment. You saw something I did not see. You built something I did not believe could be built. He set the ham on the foundation log. You have earned this. He turned and walked back down the wagon track without waiting for a response. Marta watched him go. This man who had survived the great gale of 1880, who had buried his wife and infant daughter, who had rebuilt alone and never apologized to anyone for anything in 4 decades. He had said he was wrong. She picked up the ham and carried it inside, where her children were warm and alive, and sleeping in a home that had held against the worst the world could throw at it. Agnes Olmsted came that afternoon. I passed Henning Dahl on the road, she said. He was walking, said his horse threw a shoe, but he couldn't wait to get here. She paused. He looked like he'd swallowed something that disagreed with him. He brought us a ham. Henning Dahl gave you a ham? He said he was wrong. Agnes stared at her for a long moment. Henning Dahl does not admit he's wrong. Henning Dahl does not give people hams. Henning Dahl does not walk 4 miles on a bad road to visit anyone. He did today. Agnes shook her head slowly, but she was smiling. The first genuine smile Marta had seen from her since the storm. Well, that's something. She paused. The Petersons are asking about your shelter. So are the Andersons. So is half the valley, if I'm being honest. Word is spreading. They want to know how I built it. They want to know if they can build one themselves. The storm destroyed half the cabins between here and Healdsburg. People need shelter before the next one hits. And nobody trusts conventional construction anymore. Not after what happened. Marta thought about the months of work, the clearing, the tipping, the rolling, the cutting and sealing and fitting. She thought about the physics she had puzzled out alone, the risks she had taken, the moments when she had been certain she was making a terrible mistake. I'll show them, she said. Anyone who wants to learn, I'll show them everything. Agnes nodded. I thought you might say that. She paused. You know Cyrus Whitfield is telling everyone the vat was luck. Says a real storm would have rolled it flat. Says you'll never make it through another winter. Let him say what he wants. He's also saying you'll never prove up the claim. 5 years is a long time to live in a barrel. It's a vat. Marta looked at the structure, at the home she had built from something everyone else had discarded, from something that had seemed like madness until it proved itself against the worst nature could deliver. And 5 years is nothing. I've already survived the hardest part. By spring of 1892, 4 families had built similar shelters using salvaged wine vats from abandoned wineries across the valley. The phylloxera epidemic had left dozens of such vats scattered across Sonoma and Napa counties. Orphaned equipment from failed operations, too expensive to move and too valuable to destroy. What had been industrial waste became, in the aftermath of the storm, the foundation of a small movement. The Petersons rebuilt using a 14-foot vat from the old Dominici property. The Andersons found a matched pair of smaller vats and connected them with a covered walkway, creating a 2-room structure larger than their original cabin. A family named Johansson, new arrivals from Minnesota, chose a vat over conventional construction after hearing about what had happened to their neighbors' cabins. The structures became known locally as barrel houses, though Marta always corrected anyone who used the term. Vats, she would say. They're vats. Barrels are for whiskey. The design evolved as others improved upon her original work. The Petersons added a wooden extension off the door end, creating a conventional room attached to the circular shelter. The Andersons built sleeping lofts in the upper curve of their vats, nearly doubling the usable floor space. A blacksmith in Healdsburg named Thompson developed a standardized door kit, pre-cut frame, hinges, and bar that could be installed in half the time Marta's original had required. Marta shared her methods freely with anyone who asked. She drew diagrams in the dirt outside her vat, explaining the physics of curved surfaces and distributed pressure to men who had built conventional cabins all their lives. She walked families through the process of tipping and rolling. She demonstrated how to seal seams, how to cut a door without weakening the structure, how to route a stovepipe without creating a fire hazard. She never charged for her knowledge. When people offered payment, she refused. I survived because nobody thought to look at what was already there, she said, because everyone assumed that a wine vat couldn't be a home. That shouldn't cost anyone money. Cyrus Whitfield never acknowledged that he had been wrong. He sold his interest in the Pacific Development Company the following year and moved to San Francisco, where he died of typhoid fever in 1897. He was buried in a pauper's grave because he had lost most of his money in a failed land speculation. No one from the valley attended his funeral. Marta Lindqvist proved up her homestead claim in 1896, 5 years after filing. She had met every requirement of the Homestead Act: continuous habitation, demonstrated improvements, cultivation of at least 10 acres of the property. The land office clerk who processed her final paperwork looked at the address on the form, looked at her, and shook his head with something that might have been wonder. "The barrel woman," he said. "The vat woman," she corrected. She had been correcting people for 5 years. She suspected she would be correcting them for the rest of her life. She lived on the Haas property for another 31 years after that. The original vat remained her primary home until 1899, when she finally saved enough money to build a proper cabin beside it, a small but solid structure with conventional walls and a shingled roof. She kept the vat standing, using it for storage, and as a guest room for visitors who wanted to see the structure that had become something of a local legend. Alma married a schoolteacher from Santa Rosa in 1904. She had 3 children and lived to be 82 years old. She never forgot the night of the storm, the sound of the wind, the feel of the walls vibrating, her mother's voice singing Swedish songs in the darkness to keep the fear at bay. Eric became a carpenter, specializing in cooperage repair and the conversion of industrial containers into living spaces. He built 17 vat homes over his career, each one incorporating improvements on his mother's original design. He died in 1942 at the age of 55 from pneumonia, the same illness that had nearly killed him as a child, finally claiming him 6 decades later. Marta Lindqvist died in her sleep on March 15, 1927, at the age of 73. She was buried beside Gunnar in the small cemetery outside Healdsburg, under a headstone that read only her name and dates. No mention of the vat, no mention of the storm, no mention of the children she had saved or the families she had taught. She had never wanted monuments. The vat itself stood until 1951, when the property was sold to a developer who demolished every structure to make way for new housing. By then, the barrel house movement had faded from memory, replaced by modern building techniques and materials that made the old improvisations unnecessary. The last of the converted vats was torn down in 1963. But for one night in December of 1891, when the worst storm in a decade tore through Sonoma County with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, a widow and her 2 children survived inside a structure that everyone had said would fail. Henning Dahl, who had survived the Great Gale of 1880 and buried his wife and infant daughter in its aftermath, had looked at Marta Lindqvist and delivered his verdict. "You'll freeze," he had said, standing in Brennan's general store with 4 decades of frontier survival behind him. "And those children will freeze with you." The temperature that night dropped to 19 degrees. The wind reached 107 miles per hour. 7 structures collapsed within 5 miles. 1 man died. Livestock scattered across 3 counties. The railroad was blocked for a week. And in the morning, when the wind had finally fallen and the sun broke through the clouds, Marta Lindqvist stepped out of her vat home and watched the light spread across a valley that would never look at her the same way again. The curved walls stood behind her, scratched and dented but unbroken. Inside, her children were sleeping. The stove was still warm. The air smelled of wood smoke and redwood and the particular warmth of a space that had held against everything. Henning Dahl had said she would freeze. The redwood held.